Welcome. We're going to be exploring some very fascinating subjects in this video, and I honestly think it may top the Biltmore video. So if you haven't seen that, make sure you go check it out. But the reason for this video is because we're focusing on a city and essentially breaking down its entire history while observing and collecting all of the old world architecture. Obviously, this is a huge endeavor, so I'm going to do my best to compress this information, but I think you'll be satisfied with the amount of data that we collected. You see, Charleston is an old world city, one of the oldest in America, and it actually has the most historic buildings registered with the national record than any other city in the United States. Charleston truly is fascinating, but it is also confusing and mixed with all sorts of strange, quirky stories that make its history quite questionable, especially since they're parroted by most of the local historians. Based on my interactions with the locals, it's clear to me that many of them sense that some of these stories aren't adding up. This will all be explained as the video continues, but we actually went to Charleston and did a thorough experience of the city, including speaking with many of the locals, visiting libraries, and even going on one of the weirdest, most obscene tours that I've ever been on. I'm not joking. But yeah, there's so much to cover, it's just mind-boggling, but we're about to do it. This is about to be a journey because this is what it takes for people to truly see the connections and to see how there's so much that really doesn't add up with the mainstream narrative. We deserve to ask questions on the legitimacy of these stories. I mean, after all, the tour guide even said it himself, quote, "Charleston was built off of symbolism." Before we can understand the history of Charleston, we must have a section questioning England and the monarchs who ruled it, and their allegiances. I think that most of the local historians are, at the very least, hesitant to dive into the alternative regarding royal bloodlines. But I believe it is crucial to cover the obscured side of history before even beginning the mainstream narrative. This is the only way we can begin to see the symbols responsible for making Charleston what it is today. All we hear is the promotion of this great turbulence in British history, but this really didn't start till after the supposed English Civil War, which saw the execution of Charles I. It's not until Charles II took the throne that we hear of all this lavish decadence in art, architecture, and design. Now, there are many things that don't add up with this narrative, and I think we can expose that just by digging into these personalities and biographies just a little bit further. Charles I was the king who was beheaded during the Civil War, and anytime you see Civil War, usually you know this has to do with divide and conquer, or some type of hijack. This will be further shown as we proceed, but the first tactic used in this process was religious division. The Protestants, who in the mainstream history are presented as opposed to the Catholic Church, this is really just the main piece of propaganda or tools that are being used in occulting our past. This opens a whole nother can of worms, including the true originators of these spiritual philosophies and how they were stolen and used as mind control weapons on the masses. It's just more inversion. The only real difference between Catholics and Protestants in philosophy is that one can believe that they can reach heaven by faith alone, and the other, right, the Catholics, believe that faith is done by good works. Basically, these new Protestants of the Reformation believe that you can commit evil and still be forgiven because, you got faith. Quote, "The doctrine of sola fide is related to differing views on the theological role of repentance, where believers of sola fide, following Calvin and Luther, consider repentance identical to the belief in bringing about the, quote, change of heart that constitutes faith. Prior to the Reformation, baptism was the ceremonial cleansing of original sin and formal penance was required for the absolution of post-baptismal sins." Just another excuse for these elites to get away with doing whatever they want, as we will soon see. These civil wars happened in every country. Is it not suspicious that we see this with such frequency, yet no one is suspicious whether there is some type of propaganda situated with these events, as we must agree, all this history comes from the royal monarchs and the priest. But look, you don't think there's a connection between the two? Martin Luther is one of the main historical figures behind Protestantism, a German priest and theologian, best known for Protestant Reformation and the denomination of Lutheranism. Does that not sound familiar to you? Lutheranism? Anything? Take a look at this symbol and we'll come back to it. So yeah, in 1649, Charles II comes into the picture out of nowhere and I guess fought bravely for the crown but lost to the Puritans. He was then forced into exile and humiliated. Quote, Charles then spent 6 desperate weeks as a fugitive in hiding in England. He had his hair cut short to evade capture and donned leather breeches and a felt hat, imitating a country accent. After the Restoration, the king loved to regale friends with accounts of his miraculous escape. He first took refuge at the Boscobel House near Worcester, where he narrowly escaped capture by famously hiding in an oak tree for the course of a day, consuming large quantities of beer, bread, and cheese while praying he would avoid detection by the Roundhead troops which scoured the area. End quote. 12 years later, he becomes king somehow? They really don't tell us much, but we just accept whatever story they give us. They say it was because Puritanism was in decline. Not sure about that, but the Puritans were English Protestants who beheaded his father. Why would they just let him be king after he was exiled? So, they try to act that this is when they basically go through some type of restoration or enlightenment stage in England, but I don't really buy that for 1 second. I mean, we're talking about people who slept with prostitutes, gambled, shit in bowls so their slaves could throw it out the window, backing up and causing mass disease in the city for everyone. We continue. His favorite mistress seems to be Nellie Gwyn, but she was sleeping with multiple aristocrats such as Charles Hart, Lord Buckhurst, and weirdly, she loved that they were cheating on their wives with them, so yeah, I don't know, these people really don't have any values, they were just inversionists. That's what this whole Protestantism is, or at least in its whole beginning Enlightenment stage. It was all about self-enlightenment, the true Dark Age, self-interest in the development of ego. These elites cared for nothing but themselves, while they ate off the back of their peasants while defecating simultaneously. Are we to believe that these people are the true artists behind the creation of these beautiful old world cities? Charles II had an astonishing appetite for women. That was the hallmark of his entire rule. He had over 14 illegitimate children. Consequently, it is said he was the father of his own people. I'm gonna let you guess what that means. Oh, and get this, Charles II? Yeah, he was black. They don't really tell you that in history books, huh? Quote, Charles was 1/4 Italian, and he was very dark, in fact, abnormally dark in complexion. His mother was actually reputed to have believing she birthed an actual black baby. He was called the Black Boy. Another common theme that you hear in all these stories is gambling and horse racing. All these people just spent their spare time gambling. So think about it. How many artists do you know? Do they really seem like the people to go out and spend their hobbies gambling on the abuse of horses? I don't really know any, and we'll continue to see this theme time and time again. It's not just horses. These people loved being drunkards. They were into prostitution, gambling, and it's really just as simple as that. I mean, these were not enlightened men at all. They were obsessed with the lowest aspects of being human. There also seems to be no explanation on where this passion came from to build all these massive architectures. And all these people that I know who would be involved with those activities would have no possible chance of doing anything near constructing massive churches that still cannot be replicated today. The way it worked is that a king would send out an explorer, then they would send back notes and describe what they found. In the mainstream narrative, it's just open land inhabited by savage Indians. But we will be questioning whether there's something else going on. So it seems that this explorer was named Robert Sanford. Now, This is important because this is the only proof that we have of what was going on in America during these times when the colonists first arrived. There are no pictures. All we have are leftover documents that, yes, can be forged, and all the accounts from these royal aristocrats themselves. So all we can do is decide for ourselves whether or not we should trust them. It truly isn't that hard of a task. All we have to know is who these people are and who they worked for. Robert Sanford the explorer landed in what is now the Edisto River, seems to have made friends with the local natives who accepted him in, and the story goes that he made friends with the Kiowa Indians, who, after speaking with their leader, Sasike, he was urged to allow Sanford and his companions to settle these native lands. So wait, they're telling us that the Europeans came to North America and the natives just accepted them in? They were like, oh please, I beg of you to come take our lands, here, just take it. So that's really what the history books say. Literally with no reason and no real plan, an unknown random Native American Indian gave the property of the lands of the Kiowa to the colonist. If you saw the first video, you understand how this works from a business standpoint. You see, each one of these lands were countries. Each country was assigned a king, and they were all loyal to the same hidden hand, the Headless Knight, which is not just a crest, but a symbol representing the mass forces of different family bloodlines, operating as a military unit under the control of one entity, the double-headed phoenix. And I'm not going to stop calling it a phoenix, for that is the true symbol being used. The faster we realize that, the quicker we can get to an understanding of what really is going on here. The phoenix represents fire, destruction, and rebirth. It is the power symbol of the Great Reset and the rulers who rule after it. Remember, we're going to be talking about great cataclysms that occurred in Charleston. This is not unique to this location, as there were great fires, great floods, great earthquakes, and great plagues, all of which caused unfathomable damage, creating havoc in almost every major city. We continue. In 1669, I guess there was only 3 ships that came to the Carolinas under the guidance of this Robert Sanford dude. One of them was called Carolina. Then we had Port Royal Albemarle, which only made it because the other 2 got lost in a hurricane, but they tell us conveniently that it survived somehow. One reason is because the population count doesn't really add up. But before we go over that, I need to mention that Robert Sanford conquered the whole country of Sanford for Charles II in 1666. So essentially they tell us the true founding of the Carolinas was done by Mr. Robert the Explorer under the royal command of the Corporation of England under the rule of the Vatican. Again, the Vatican during this time was a multifaceted elite family force, primarily shifting during this Venetian Renaissance. These inversionists took over the church. You'll see this with the Rosicrucians, and then dominating the entirety of the world, primarily the German empires. English, France, Spain, Dutch are all Germanic-based languages etymologically speaking. So if we are to see this from a royal bloodline standpoint, we can conclude that this was one force. Spain was owned by the Jesuits, but not only that, the Black Moorish nobility. The main immigrants mentioned in Charleston, or really the history of the Carolinas, were English and Irish immigrants. Only few, if any, references to the Dutch being here, but you know what this is getting to, right? They tell us that the slaves built all of Charleston. That's right, and we're going to have some serious questions about all that. But furthermore, who do you think supplied all these slaves? I mean, Charleston is said to be the very place where the most slaves were imported. But not just that, supplying over 40% of all enslaved Africans in North America. The East Dutch India connection has their hidden hand in this too. For some reason, randomly in the 1670s, we hear England coming into this story, and now the entire East Coast is the property of England? No real wars or anything with the Dutch, because remember, the first country to be founded in America is New Netherlands, which was a corporation and country under the rule of another company, which was its entirely own entity and country, with shareholders and everything. This was an operation. not some random musings of Charles II who just had some taste for extravagance. Come on, historians, we know better to accept this repetitive narrative at face value. These were slobs, lazy, disgusting, filthy aristocrats who had no interest in being intellectuals, but tyrants with an obsession with feces, alcohol, and hookers, while at the same time getting together with their buddies, having orgies with each other, having fun performing blasphemy. Yeah, that's the new church. Also, the tour guide kept saying, oh yeah, we were big enemies with France, because one of the people actually asked a question about this. And he said that during the colonial days, they were in war with France. And I just don't buy that at all because literally the Carolinas were named after Charles IX of France, which even he said that the streets were literally copy and paste. Quote, how unoriginal. I mean, they literally brought up how all the street names are kind of like the same in every city. I mean, have you not seen that? If they were truly founded independently, then why are there not more creative and well thought out names behind all these cities? It's usually just these elite figures who founded the city and then slapped their name on it to show property ownership and to continue this story of oppression. So this new church, and again, this is a vast topic, I can't break it down in one video, but this gets into the occult, astrotheology, the origins of religion, and how there was a possible hijack, meaning the Bible that we know today was rewritten and presented for the minds of esoteric societies with the intention of programming the human race. This was inversion, the new Atlantis, the rise of the defiance to the church, the religion of science, and they would show this by losing all sense of morals as they spread destruction and bloodshed across the world. This truly started with the Canaanites, but for now, we will start off during these Renaissance periods. The Rosicrucians were a worldwide brotherhood who claimed to possess esoteric wisdom that was handed down from ancient times. It's important for us to study their symbols. The rose on the cross, otherwise known as the rosal pentagram. Remember what I said about inversion? And would you look at that? The exact same symbol as the family coat of arms of Martin Luther. Now, I'm not saying all Rosicrucian knowledge is evil, or even occult knowledge for that matter. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about royal bloodlines and their associates. And in order to continue this journey, we must learn about these secret societies that act in secret behind the church. This is crucial to understand, and here it is, because people always say, what's the purpose? Why would they keep this all hidden from us? Because the new church controlled all these founding states in America. These churches were the first thing built, right? Or founded really, when these settlers arrived. And the first in Charleston is St. Philip's, or actually the Church of England, as we will see, but the St. Michael's is said to be this church now, or something like that. They always say that they rebuild these structures after these cataclysms, but we'll question that shortly. I should also bring up St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. Look at this and tell me you don't think this looks evil. Anyways, what I'm referencing is the checkerboard and red door symbolism. These are major red flags, not to mention the Rosicrucian connections we're about to cover. Also, this is right on Vanderhorst Street. It's the same thing as Sade. This was the Reformation, the separation from the supposed church, right? They fired the Pope, they all became their own gods, and now their religion was the cult of science, lies, and destruction. Martin Luther is just another Marquis de Sade. No joke, he's responsible for promoting this whole sexual reformation. Martin Luther promoted and created same-sex sexuality to a certain degree. This all has to do with sodomy because the old church literally had laws preventing it. Therefore, there was this sick need by the politicians and aristocrats to promote this, which, if you don't know what sodomy is, go look it up, but yeah, they would have these massive orgies together. And yep, that's a reference to Marquis Sade, which I can't really understand why all these scholars seem to worship him. Oh yeah, and let's remember that Martin Luther King Jr. was literally named after this rebellious gay monk who wanted to perform sodomy so bad. I'm looking at this article talking about this, And please understand, this is no way an attack on modern homosexuality or the church or anyone. Adults can make their own decisions, but when covering the history of these churches and royal monarchs, we must cover their personalities and origins. This was spawned from rebellion against the church, and even the original old church was willing to accept these gays and lesbians with dignity and respect. But the truth of the matter is, the Catholics believed sodomy was intrinsically filthy. Now, I'm not saying I agree. What people do is really none of my business, but it's interesting that there were laws in place to prevent this, possibly in place to prevent the loss of morals that we see with the destruction and pillaging of other native lands. And look, local historians are going to have to be fair. These museums and history books do not cover this aspect. We're covering the alternative history and trying to understand another explanation of what may be going on here. And in order to do that properly, we must cover secret societies. We aren't finished with Martin Luther though, as he's very important to understanding what's going on here. You see, many scholars will laugh and say, well, Martin was opposed to the Catholic Church. Okay, well, he was also an anti-Semite, or as history puts it, he was anti-Judaism. He's the author of The Jews in Their Lies, a German book from the supposed 16th century era in Germany, and it seems that the issue stems that he was not allowed to convert Jews to Lutheranism or Protestant Christianity. And in so, he wrote this book as a temper tantrum, essentially saying some pretty graphic and horrifying things towards a group of people. Now, trust me, I'm sure most of you know about the alternative to the H word. It's also called The Greatest Lie Ever Told as a title. But yeah, this connects with traitors and the betrayals of one's own people. This is denounced, of course, because this would not be so good for their origins. That is all that really can be said. However, the majority of you know what that means. What we are witnessing is a fight between different bloodline families for status and prominence. It is a petty play between immature royal aristocrats who wanted to have their own cult and power. This happens with every early denomination of the new church. He wanted the Jews to come to his religion, the new religion in which everyone can basically just have faith. Crimes are not really taken into consideration when entering heaven. As long as you have faith, you're pretty much good. I'm not sure about all of that. This is just the start of liberalism and the worship of really anything you want, which, again, you think wouldn't really be an issue, right? But it basically led to a bunch of inversionists getting in charge. And the contradictions are endless because he wasn't even racist towards the Jews, he just disagreed with them philosophically. In fact, quote, at the beginning of his career, it is often said that Luther was apparently sympathetic to Jewish resistance to the Catholic Church. He wrote early in his career, "The Jews are blood relations of our Lord. If it were proper to boast of flesh and blood, the Jews belong more to Christ than we. I beg therefore, my dear papist, if you become tired of abusing me as a heretic, that you begin to revile me as a Jew." End quote. So basically, he wrote to his leader and said, please don't kill me, because he was considered to be a heretic by the church. And so yeah, he writes in this letter saying, oh yeah, the Jews are closer to Christ than we are, the Protestants, but please, if you're getting fed up with me, just call me a Jew. Then it seems because of the infiltration of other bloodlines did not work as Martin Luther wanted, he decided to start creating anti-Jewish propaganda, which I honestly find highly sus because, I mean, the Vatican were already getting pissed with this guy. You really think he's just gonna get away with publishing this material with no questions asked? No, this is the beginning of a setup. Heraldry is the key into understanding this, as we can see the connection between these different bloodlines and who ruled them. But not only that, we see that these people communicate through symbolism, as do the Rosicrucians. So if we go to Wikipedia, we're going to see some occulted knowledge in action. And also, the occult is nothing to fear. It is simply that which is hidden. One of the specialties of secret occult orders or societies is hiding symbols in plain sight. You see, Martin Luther belonged to the German congregation of Augustinian hermits. From 1503, he took over the professorship in Wittenberg. He had a back or investor in doing so. This is not really considered at all in most history books, but you can look into it yourself. His patron was Johann von Staupitz, who was the vicar of this hermit order. Now this Staupitz guy not only belonged to the Rosicrucian Lodge, he was the leader in Nuremberg. Quote, Luther was a slave to the leader of the Nuremberg Lodge. Norbert Hellmuth correctly observes and presents the following passage from Luther's letter of October 3rd, 1511 to von Staupitz as one of the many evidences for this. You leave me too much. Because of you, I felt like a weaned child about his mother. I dreamed of you last night. I felt as if you were parting from me. I cried bitterly. Then you waved your hand. I may be calm. You would come back. End quote. Seems that they had a relationship if you ask me. This also connects with the Freemasonic Lodge in Nuremberg, which they say worked in the spirit of humanism. Essentially what I'm saying, because this is a deep rabbit hole, is these lodges incited young Luther to be the face of the Reformation, while the order, the Rosicrucian order, stayed in secret. This is not a conspiracy theory. We're simply looking at mainstream history and asking questions as you can do yourself. Now, we can fully understand the lion symbolism as mentioned in the Biltmore video, as the Rosicrucian authors are the ones responsible for this divide and conquer tactic. You see, this requires an understanding of how politics is used to create polarities. This is still being done today. So just consider that for a moment. You see the divide going on right now. This is nothing new. Now, during the 16th century, politics were basically Catholic versus Protestant, which was the divide and conquer tactic for its time. It's the same old Republican versus Democrat. I kid you not, but people still want to use this argument that, oh, they were fighting against each other, so they were enemies. No. In fact, most wars throughout history were religious wars which were fought simply on small differences, but overall, they contained the same base doctrine. It's all petty politics to distract the masses, but in this case, most importantly, to offset any type of breadcrumbs left over of this hijack for future historians. This will be proven with the writings of Paracelsus, a famous occultist who was known for revealing much, but this is only known to those who study the occult, meaning these people will take in anyone who show an interest in the occult. So that was another tool for gathering those with spiritual gifts during this time. There is a cryptic book called The Prophecies of Paracelsus that shows us some very interesting things involving these royal symbols. His real name was Theophrastus Bombast von Hohenheim, and he was considered to be one of the first alchemists. And I'm not saying there isn't knowledge to be gained from his works, but perhaps this goes actually way back and this was a recycled art. But anyways, essentially what I'm saying is that he was in cahoots with Martin Luther and the royalty of the time. At 16, Paracelsus went to the University of Basel, which, if you look into it, seems to be the origin of the Rosicrucians. Again, hidden knight controlled by the lion? So in this prophecy book, he's giving these weird cryptic stories behind all these heraldry symbols as to embed them with magic. He was hired to do this by the royals. These are now sigils. For the fleur-de-lis, he calls it a flower that will grow to a predestined height and goes on about how it is endowed with magic, and this takes a back and forth. But basically, this is a symbolism for the seductiveness of magic and how it is a flower that must be used with responsibility. This is the true symbol of the fleur-de-lis, not some random symbol we see associated with the French. Quote, a flower groweth to the destined height. He that causeth her to grow also causeth her to fade. This happens to thee, for magic hath therewith adorned thee, that thy coming up should be known, and also how thou hast come to naught. For before thou wast, magic hath known thee, and therefore compared thee to a flower that today is in bloom and tomorrow is withered. Wisdom and fear of God would have preserved thee, but thou hast overlooked it. Thine own wisdom has seduced thee." End quote. So yeah, and they also go over the lion symbolism, essentially saying that the lion is the power of God and that you'll be brought to silence in its presence or rule. But yeah, the origins of the Rosicrucians were started from an assembly of Christian Kabbalists who were prepared to spread a supposed illumination and religious change throughout Europe. Now, I can't break down all of these things, but I'm telling you, look at this from an understanding of heraldry and you'll see the secret code. The very next figure is the monk in a river with a paddle in his hand writing history, meaning he's basically the power behind what was written. It goes on to say that these families must be tried just like gold must be, so an alchemy reference of them becoming enlightened, and in doing so, all these families would share the wealth of the world. Then the next is the bear sucking its paws, a symbol well known in heraldry, but now we're seeing its magical significance. This is gluttony, the eating of the honeycombs, as we see a city in the background. But the real symbol is to remind the elites to not get carried away with using too much magic for pleasure, as it will be their downfall. Magic must be used with balance. That's what the main theme of all this is. Next, we see St. Peter's chair upside down, which is a symbol for the firmness of these inversionists and how they can rule in this position with ease. Then of course we have the swordsman attacking the land of other peoples. Paracelsus says, quote, "Too much kindness giveth too much evil. When the evil despiseth the kindness, and the folly thereof allows it to advance in its undertaking." End quote. Then we see a great city with hands over tearing a charter, and this is telling you about hijacks and resets right here in this book. And this also covers the Masons, the stag symbolism, the lamb, and any scholar of symbolism should be able to see these connections clearly. It is said that Francis Yates was one of the first Rosicrucians, but we will see that this goes earlier to the Germanic royal bloodlines. The whole purpose of the Rosicrucians were to have a, quote, "universal reformation of mankind through a science allegedly kept secret for decades until the intellectual climate might receive it." End quote. I wonder what that means. I'll tell you what I think. Basically, this is a mind control tactic, but not only that, a reset of humanity and her philosophies. Also interesting that the Temple of the Rose Cross is buildings being moved on wheels with wings, meaning the moving of the church, the creation of the new church of science. This actually connects with mortal engines too, but you see what they're hinting at. They're saying until the intellectual climate might receive it or better perceive it. That time is now. These were occultists behind the scenes creating the political warfare. This is also connected with John Dee and Francis Bacon, which again opens up a whole nother can of worms. But to shorten it, this was the underground influence behind all these countries in Europe during these times. We must cover the Reformation as it is intimately connected with Charles II and the founding of Charleston. I mean, what kind of Enlightenment period are we even talking about? Francis Bacon, you guys probably know him, right? William Shakespeare was one of the founding writers of the King James Version of the Bible. No, I'm not claiming that he wrote the original Bible. I'm just saying he was the editor of both Shakespearean literature and the King James Bible behind the scenes. This is actually well known in scholarly circles, so don't take my word for it. It's not just a myth. The evidence is there if you dig around, but essentially what this shows is how propaganda was being orchestrated behind the scenes by the same writers. So how are we to know if any of these figures even truly existed? Another proof of this is the blatant Rosicrucian symbolism of the first cover of the King James Bible. This is the first illustration released as an engraving, and if we open our eyes and look at the symbolism, we can clearly see this was created by inversionist Rosicrucians who were getting ready to be the foundation of the Freemasons in America. The reason we spent this time covering the Rosicrucians first is because when you learn about Charleston, the first thing you learn about is King Charles II. But who was he and what was he all about? He essentially was part of the Reformation of England, or he was the Reformation, the process of the Puritans, who were English Protestants who had separated from the Catholic Church. Now, people may find this as a shock because we hear tales about the Salem witch trials, right? And how these Puritans were such a pure people. But if we look into the origin of this philosophy, it really starts with Martin Luther, the Rosicrucians, and secret occult German Dutch orders. The whole hunting witch stuff is just propaganda to make the occult and witchcraft seem like paranoid superstition. But the real witches were the intellectuals. They were the alchemists and masters of philosophical symbolism that then allowed them to control and mentally manipulate the entire population. We're dealing with mentalism on a whole nother level. It doesn't mean that these philosophies do not contain truth within themselves, but that they have been abused and distorted to meet an end goal. Charles II and Robert Murray seem to be the same person, and yes, this is where I think the name Murray actually comes from. It's spelled a little bit differently as you go earlier, but we're going to be talking about that name a lot in this video. Now, you tell me that they don't look exactly the same, which is weird because there's a Charles of Spain, Germany, France. All these countries have the same names that they give the kings. How can we conclude that they are enemies? They're literally the same people in bloodline. They even admit this with the Habsburgs. I mean, this dude looks like the Crimson Chin or something. So yeah, they were all related, but Robert Murray was a huge Freemasonic figure in Scottish rites who seemed to give great counsel to the Majesty, Charles II. So we know that Charles II were hanging out with all these people. On June 29, 1660, 6 years before the founding of the Carolinas, Charles II was at supper with the Duke of Buckingham and John Haydon, who was the self-proclaimed champion of the Rosicrucian Seraphical Illuminated Fraternity. You see, Haydon was delighted when Buckingham had introduced him into the good graces of the king, and so he was introduced into royalty at the time. Then under a pseudonym, Eugenius Theodidactus, he had started to collect investors for his endeavor to then promote Rosicrucian propaganda. His writings basically show the Rosicrucian influence on the development of Freemasonry and the Royal Society. In 1658, Haydon published a new method of Rosicrucian physics, in which he stressed the Jewish or Kabbalistic origins of Rosicrucianism, which is true. He claims that Moses was father and founder of the fraternity, which was the order of Elias or Ezekiel. Obviously, this is a huge topic, but the Rosicrucians could easily take up an entire library. However, the point is to get a glimpse that Charles II and the Church of England were all a part of this Rosicrucian goal to move into a new Atlantis, a new church, a new humanity. Being that many of the founders of the new churches in America are steeped in this connection, even in Charleston, do the red doors on this Lutheran church make more sense now? This is a Rosicrucian temple. Study the symbols and you'll see them everywhere. Okay, so to finish off this section, we got a couple more facts about Charles II just to drive home the point, and so there's no doubt left behind or anything. This ties in with the last video with the Dutch and their corporations, as the Rosicrucians were being formed during this exact time period, and there's no denying that they had a huge influence over the Baltic Lion or Northern Europe. We see proof of this within the East Dust India Company logo. I didn't really elaborate in the last video, but the pentagram that I mentioned is the Rosal pentagram. And yes, it is a pentagram, and it is Rosicrucian symbolism. These aren't things that history museums are just going to grab your hand and say, oh here, let me show you. they're not in the business of making you aware of the hidden hand behind all these different events. You have to see the symbols and put it together yourself. Furthermore, King Charles grew up in his father's Dutch and French art collection. His younger cousin was Louis XIV. Remember the poop video? Again, this all connects here. These are all the same families and they were doing all the same type of stuff. So, when he was restored to the throne, the Dutch gave him a huge collection of artwork. That sounds familiar. One of the most curious events about this whole Rosicrucian manifestos, as we're talking about with Francis Yates, is that it described the workings and missions of a hidden society, the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. This was designed to be an alternative to the Jesuit order, with the pursuit of, quote, universal and general reformation. This would be the final completion of their works that were supposedly begun by the Protestants. This goal of reformation was to bring together all the arts and sciences under a natural and spiritual philosophy, and even though many of the main figures argued in their tenets in this way, their true manifestations was in self-enlightenment, which resulted in Charlestown, essentially being a getaway liberal city where you could worship whatever you want, get drunk, gamble, brothels, all of it. And it didn't really matter because remember, as long as you had faith, you were forgiven. How convenient. Now to show you that this is all but a Venetian Jesuit order in control and have been in control ever since Rome, we have the Knights of Malta. These are the origins of the Rosicrucians, also known as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Order, as this was a secret Catholic sovereign military order of Malta, also known as the Sovereign Military Order of St. John of Jerusalem, a closed fraternity of the Roman Catholic Church. So we're just talking about brotherhoods here. You must be initiated, and as we can see with the coat of arms, this is but another underground program of the royal throne who, interestingly, are always named similar things. Like in 1530, so 100 years earlier, the Knights of Malta were in a perpetual lease with Charles I of Spain for the Maltese Islands. These secret orders were controlled by royalty. They also have the same exact Protestant equivalent, who are known as the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, gained even greater credibility when the head of the British Empire, H.M. Queen Victoria, became the sovereign head in 1888. This technique used in implementing this agenda is called Hegelian dialectic, which essentially is mind control techniques used in directing the thoughts and actions of the public to implement an end goal. First, you have a thesis. Then you need the antithesis. Then you push for synthesis. In other words, problem, reaction, solution. This is the basis for implementing change in civilization from these esoteric inversionists under the guise of intellectualism that then is promoted and funded by the state. If we're going to take into consideration these secret occult orders, royal bloodlines, and the heraldry connection, and this will be further repeated and further expanded upon on every video because it is crucial in decoding our past. You see, we historians should all be well versed in the occult, for it is the only way to truly understand symbols, but more so, we must participate in the process of de-occulting, otherwise the process of unveiling that which is hidden. This is necessary if we are to understand our history. So we come back to Charleston, and the story goes that life was super easy for the colonists, unlike in Virginia and New England. Can't help to wonder why, but these Indians basically just gave them free land as the story goes. They tell us that in 1670, North America and the West Indies had been settled by the English. But I don't buy this one bit, since New Netherlands was conceived in 1621. There was never really any war between the English and Dutch, and They just sort of merged, but the weird thing is they don't really talk about New Netherlands. They also don't mention that the Germanic languages include English, German, Netherlandic, Danish, Swedish, Icelandic, Norwegian, and Frankish or French language. We're talking about the same families here. And also, the German tongue is said to be the tongue of black magic and sorcery. So where do you even start? I mean, you think that was a lot? We haven't even started yet. I guess let's start with star forts because they don't seem to think it's important to mention that Charleston was built entirely on a huge star fort. Yeah, and we're talking early 1700s. But wait, I thought the story was these were built for the Civil War. So wait, if you type in earliest fort in Charleston or Carolina, it's only going to say Fort Sumter. So basically, we're dealing with the same layout that we see in Europe. And we're going to be breaking down Fort Sumter down as well, but that will have its own section. To be honest with you, I don't really think that any of these local historians have a clue of what's really going on, but that will be a common theme because I remember the tour guide saying that the entire land of Charleston was basically built on oyster shells, dead bodies, and dirt. And he was like joking, like, yeah, you guys have been walking over dead bodies this whole time, ha, so get used to it. Just really weird stuff like that, and it's all over the town. But one thing that we really need to bring up is that Charleston had the most bastions, or what we in the alternative call star forts. Now, we are of the opinion that these served different purposes than we are told in the mainstream, but again, we must take these things one step at a time. Barbados and Charleston are heavily connected, and that'll be another thing that's brought up in these stories as well. They say that these forts were designed to keep the Spanish out, but as we know, literally the King of Spain was called Charles as well, so I'm not really sure what they're talking about. It seems that they're all the same people. We have no evidence that they actually built these early forts, and what I mean by that is, why are we ruling out the possibility that these may have been found, as the word founded implies, that they actually found these lost architectures when exploring new lands? So they say that this original settlement was in Old Town Creek and then later moved onto the Ashley River for whatever reason. So the first Charlestonians were more like soldiers and farmers. That's what they say. They would guard at night and plant all day, which I suspect that many of these farms and produce in this land was already well established. Many rich elites from Barbados came and colonized the area, and the way it worked back then is that you basically had to get permission from the king to own land, and then they would approve it, and only wealthy families could afford the trip. So this was all some brotherhood, fraternity. This was an operation, and you're not going to have poor people making this long trip. So in 1671, there were only 30 houses and 200 people in Charleston, they tell us. So that would roughly be 6 people per house, but still that's not considering the slaves, their habits, their culture. I mean, this would be a messy lifestyle. It makes you truly question whether or not this was possible in the time frame that they tell us. The Church of England was established, but there was no ministry yet, and this church, which we're going to be talking about a lot, is called St. Philip's. But they say the first one was a wooden church, and in the first decades the proprietors encouraged all religious toleration, right? But it's not really true. It was mostly Catholics and Protestants, all of which had to get permission and be anointed. There's some crazy stuff that we're actually going to say about this church, but we gotta wait towards the end of the video. Basically, during this time, Lord Ashley Cooper was one of the Lord Proprietors, or in other words, shareholders of the early Carolinas. Again, he looks just like Charles II. They all have the same facial structure. He was responsible for restoring Charles II back to power. He is a part of the Shaftesbury Order, or the 9th Earl of Shaftesbury, who was also named Ashley Cooper with the copy and paste. And he just so happens to be a provincial Grand Master of the Freemasons in Dorset. These proprietors were a part of the secret order, And we know this because they supposedly planned out the town with the exact same design in London, and it was this checkerboard design proposed by Hooke and Wren, and it also happened right on the fire of 1666. So anyways, they decided to just move the entire town in 1679, like a decade after they got started on the city. They had already started building buildings, but then they moved the entire city to Oyster Point. And then they changed their minds again and moved back to the Ashley River in the spring of 1680. Now all of a sudden, this is a brand new site, and then only 2 years later, now there's 100 houses. So, the first English church, which was St. Philip's, is located where St. Michael's is now, but then they moved it to a new location, all of which makes it extremely confusing. So by 1682, we have hundreds of buildings, and a traveler described it as having large streets and buildings with great ornament and beauty. So now it's 1690, and they're telling us that the population is only 1,200, which in comparison, there were only 3,900 in New York. Let's also keep in mind that New York was called New Amsterdam during these times. So with only 1,000 people, we have a Star Fort city that was moved multiple times in a variety of different churches, such as St. Philip's, and then you also have the circular church that they said they rebuilt multiple times, but we'll cover that towards the end. It was also known as the Presbyterian Church, which again, we're gonna have to be able to see the many heads of the dragon. But yes, Presbyterians are just Lutherans with small differences in doctrine. They are both Protestant Christian churches. It's the same thing Martin Luther did. Basically, all these different cult leaders started their own denomination of the same root, but created a variety of different branches. The French Protestants, or the Huguenots, who were Presbyterians. So again, and make sure you remember this name, but all these different people that were colonizing the Americas, they were allies. But back to the Huguenots in Charleston. So the Huguenots were allowed to congregate here and build their own church along with many other Congregationalists. This is actually how Meeting Street got its name. It's the meeting place where all these different Protestant cults, who really mostly were in defiance to the Catholic teachings, but again, during this time this was just a cover as the power had moved into the Venetian Enlightenment, and this street is where they would all set up their different denominations or family crest mind control weapons. Of course, this was done in order to get ready and program the masses who would be imported back in after a city was wiped and renovated. Meeting Street really was the only street for a while because there were no street names. This gets back to that copy and paste stuff, so they just start slapping their names on this, and of course, Bay Street, which was just called the Bay. So during this time, it was a complete fortified city. And this is what the experts say, they know about this. In other words, it was on top of a star fort, and it consisted of 6 bastions. These are not really as well known as Fort Sumter and the other 4 Civil War forts, but these were called Craven's Bastion at the end of what is Market Street, Blake's Bastion, where the Exchange Building stands, Grandsville Bastion, the site of the current-day Masonic Temple. Water Street was a creek and a fortified wall that ran along the northern bank and around the entire town. There was also Carteret's Bastion, and as the experts themselves describe it, quote, Charlestown was in many ways a medieval fortified city, end quote. The French Protestants rushed into the city, and these were called the Huguenots. If we take a look at their family crest, we can see who they belonged to. They were not poor at all, and in fact, one of the first Huguenots that we know of is the mother of Gabriel Manigault, who wrote home claiming that they were all experiencing great difficulties when they arrived to early Charleston, saying that they had disease, famine, poverty, hard labor, yet the Manigault family ended up being one of the richest families in Charleston. So of course, again, they tell us the rags to riches story. So these French Protestants became big names in Charleston, such as Legris, Goudard, Gaylord, Laurens, Mouzon, Poilu, and Ravenel. Then of course we have the Irish, which there are many public figures and governors in Charleston who were from Ireland, such as Richard Curle and James Moore. Many Irish family names exist till this day in Charleston. Since Charleston's conception, it really was just an outpost of the Barbados, a colony of a colony, which is really similar to the Dutch India Companies and New Netherlands, yet they tell us that Carolina's very existence was constructed to take in the Barbadians, mostly because the island was full at this point, and they tell us that they needed more land. So in 1674, there were 50,000 whites in Barbados, 80,000 blacks, which consisted mostly of French Protestants, Irishmen, and a few Dutch and Jews. Wait, so Barbados was settled in 1627, and they waited almost 50 years, and they didn't get started in the Carolinas until 50 years later? Why not earlier? They were running out of land, but maybe this is because this is all a setup. I mean, Barbados had multiple factories already by this time in 1670. So then wait, who are these people? Because if these are the real first Carolinians, look at their coat of arms. In the modern day, you will see the symbol and coat of arms of Barbados to be the hidden knight, and we have a black hand holding an X, or cross of sugarcane sticks. This symbol will be referenced later, so take note. Does this look familiar? Then we see another tree symbol, but furthermore, it is held by the fish and the pelican, which this is the proof you're seeking. This is a Rosicrucian coat of arms. You can even see the rose. The clue is one of the most prolific symbols in Rosicrucianism, the jewel of the rose cross. A pelican self-inflicting harm in order to feed her children with her own blood. Then behind the pelican, we see a white cross with a bright red rose being supported and designed by the Freemason compass and funded and controlled by the royal monarch, symbolized by the crown piece on top. Together, this creates the one-eye pyramid symbol as well. But we're not through with Barbados just yet. For the older coat of arms shows even more hidden truths. Remember what I was saying about Phoenix and resets? Look at this coat of arms of Bridgetown, Barbados, which was the capital and founding. In Latin, this reads, "From fire to light. From the past, let us rise again." They're telling you that they rose from the ashes to create a new order, and again, you can still sort of see the V and floral symbolism here. This was founded by the English East India Company, which we will see be the start of English slavery as they tell us. These corporations that were being created by these different branches of the royal monarch were constructed so that different bloodlines could start ventures through investments and shares. They would pool their money into different business ideas and profit off of them, and one of those ideas involved enslaving the natives against their own will to produce sugar factories to create a cash crop, or so they tell us. I also don't really think that these West India companies that they had for like every different country, including the East companies, and so I'm not really sure why we're to believe that they're separate, to be honest. So we'll just condense them into one single entity and question it from that perspective. The settlement of Barbados was established as a proprietary colony and funded by Sir William Corden, who just so happened to have grown up in the Netherlands, and he married the deaf and dumb daughter of Peter Cromling, a Dutch merchant who had brought him a dowry of £60,000. In 1600, William returned to London and Peter remained as his quote, agent in Holland. So yes, the Dutch East India Company and West were secretly funding other ventures and bloodlines. If you look up William Corton on Wiki, it says he discovered an uninhabited island. Yet, if you look at the history of Barbados, we get a little history before colonization section that they for some reason leave out of his bio. They say that there are settlements that go back 2,000 years, Yet, it took until these drunk, filthy, tyrannical parasites came in and decided that they would just take over and build a city? Or is something else happening? Were they already cities on these lands? There are multiple references to dark-colored natives that long inhabited these islands. Interestingly, it was named Barbados, meaning bearded ones, and they say this is because of the trees, but I wonder if this is a reference to the peoples. The reason it was said to be uninhabited is because this was claimed by Spanish riders so that they could be used as slaves. So there's one historical cover-up that the mainstream is well aware of. So the whole goal of Barbados was to convert it into an entire factory and a retreat for the elites, that by the 1640s, sugarcane was introduced from Brazil, which was colonized by the Dutch at the time. To understand this further, we must dive into what is known as the Venetian black nobility. Now, what I'm about to say may come as a surprise, but this is not just a symbolic name, it is also literal. I'll explain shortly. The whole basis of Venice is that it went against the church and essentially had its own reformation of sorts, becoming the first to go through this enlightenment, or as we know, self-enlightenment phase. You see, they say Venice went into decline in the 15th century. But no, these bloodlines just passed their wealth into different families so that they could control in the shadows. But this was just one portion of the symbolism. You see, the most powerful families of the black nobility are located in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece, and this seems to be the hierarchy enlisted. Now this is some deep stuff and will require some critical thinking. But remember, we're talking about Charles II and how all these elites were interbreeding with each other. Well, he was black. And actually, something you don't really learn about in history is that the Moors actually were in control of Spain for over 300 years, but not only that, they gained control of Sicily and Italy over 1500 years ago, they tell us. This is actually still visible within the phenotypes of the inhabitants as they appear mixed. This becomes crucial to note because there's this idea that the white man is the enemy, that they are the parasite who came in and caused all this havoc. And I'm not saying they aren't a part of this, but I can tell you right now, the parasite has nothing to do with race or phenotypes. It is but a spiritual parasite that has infected all of humanity. What I mean by this is the original Aryan or noble races consisted of multiple cultures. Aryan does not mean white, it simply means noble ones, and these people were the ones who spread knowledge after the destruction of Atlantis. Now, according to Donnelly, the Fomorians were the first pirates, and if you haven't seen our work on the Irish and secret Black history videos, this is all about to connect. So as chaos and self-enlightenment started to kick in, the hijack consisted of multiple cultures turning to survival. After all, there were many cataclysms during this time. The Canaanites formed, and several other cults, such as the Arabic Sephardic Jews, who were really established under the Moorish rule of Spain. And if you're new to all this, we also have to consider timeline fraud. For now, I'm going to leave that out because it will overcomplicate things, but keep that in mind as we're discussing these matters. What I'm telling you is that we have been sold a story of slavery, yet there's evidence to suggest that blacks were in fact the nobles of Europe, and in Africa, the leaders would actually be the ones selling slaves to the Dutch East India Company. Blacks sold blacks. Those were the first true slave owners in America if we're going to talk about African history. And also, this isn't hate in any type of way. I'm not saying that one race or blacks or white, not one color is solely responsible for putting humanity under a spell. I would never make that claim. It was a product of multiple bloodline families from multiple cultures. But do not underestimate the Moorish power and history of Europe. It's simple. It was just covered up and hidden. But now, with our current knowledge, we can begin to understand that perhaps there is an agenda behind all of this. In fact, all of Barbados is Catholic Jesuit in origin. You can see the remnants of these Catholic cults or Knights of Malta, but what if this was put into play so that the true bloodlines behind the scenes, right? They would never be able to be identified. Now, I'm not saying anything just yet. I'm just going to be showing you the research. Look, here's an article that claims Black history and Black nobility was tucked away, and this was presented by a Black Dutch researcher named Egmond Codfried. And I'm not saying I agree, but I just find this fascinating and I believe it deserves to be explored. Quote, Black nobility in Europe? Yes, according to Black Dutch researcher Egmond and author of book Belle van Zoylen's Forgotten Grandmother, there was Black nobility in Europe, but their history and images were later carefully tucked away and erased from history. His claims are controversial and of course not accepted by European historians, end quote. It's honestly tiring to hear all these supremacists still promoting racial divide, and I'm not doing that at all. We all know that white elites have ruled as the face. I'm just trying to show you that there's another head to the dragon that has been hidden, because it seems that some of the main Black supremacist talking points are that whites are parasites who came out of the Caucasus Mountains, that they are mutations that enslaved all these aboriginals on the native lands, yet they also want to claim that they were in control of all of Europe. So which is it? If you were in control of Europe, then that means you were connected to the royal bloodlines. And perhaps there's something to be asked on the Black phenotypes presented within these royal families. I am of the opinion that all of humanity has committed evil, right? Because this ties back into Black Freemasonry and the Oddfellows. We can't just blame a single race for being responsible for all the evil of humanity. It keeps us in a state of identity crisis and victimhood. Plus, to say that only white people are capable of such meticulous planning and power is absurd. Extreme evil requires genius, which all peoples possess. We must break free of these chains and start asking questions on how we arrived to our current location. Okay, so now we're going to break down all the main things you hear about Charleston when you Google it or go on a tour or visit a museum. This will just be so that we can condense it all and then just consider it from an alternative viewpoint. No other town can truly be called a pirate town like Charleston in early colonial days, or at least that's what they tell us. One of the most well-known stories is Blackbeard the Pirate. And so you hear about this, right? It's this random guy out of nowhere comes with 4 massive ships, and this is around 720. And so he holds up the entire economy of Charleston and slows it to a standstill. They say that his name was Edward Thatch or Edward Teach, which according to Wiki, there's really not that much known about his early life. He seems to have associated with royalty during this time, because how do you get 4 ships when they first came to the Carolinas? These settlers had the investment of rich aristocrats, and they only came in 3 ships. Only 1 made it, but this pirate has 4 ships, and he also goes on to steal a bunch more, so this dude was ballin'. So yeah, some of these ships that he captured were these French slave ships. Then he named it Queen Anne's Revenge. Then somehow he has an army of 300 men. But think about it, they never really explain why they called him Blackbeard. Of course, they just say that he had a really black beard, but just seems strange. Anyways, he shows up and takes people hostage, such as Samuel Wragg and other councilmen. But not only that, he took 9 other ships, and so now he has like 400 men. So he basically has an army. And then think about it, what do we know about the Moors and Fomorians? They were pirates. So could this have been some operation funded by royalty? Either way, it gets weirder. So they say this Blackbeard guy came in and is like, I demand mercury and catheters, because they wanted to shove this stuff up their bums and inside their genitals. I'm not even kidding. this was how they cured syphilis back then. They have multiple mercury stories like this, which is connected to a slave story, which we'll cover soon. I should also go ahead and mention Rainbow Row, which is the most classic, iconic thing in Charleston. We'll talk about it more later, but I just wanted to mention that when you look this up, they try to say that this was painted because the slaves used them as supply storage units and they were illiterate, so they wanted to keep track of where the supplies were, or that the sailors were so drunk that they used it to find their way home. I don't really know how to say this, but come to find out by the local tour guide that, no, they were all brothels, and Charleston had basically the most brothels in America, supposedly. And this isn't even the most insane part, it gets stranger. So, we get to this famous Stede Bonnet, or the Gentleman Pirate, which was basically this guy with a family, wife, and kids and everything. And then out of nowhere, randomly, he's like, you know what? I want to be a pirate. And he leaves his entire life behind, basically meets up with Blackbeard somehow, and then now they're working together, I guess? Anyways, after General Rhett and all these supposed pirate laws came in, the person who really took the blame for all of this was Stede Bonnet. And this guy was just an idiot. He was a fake pirate who couldn't even lead his own crew, but they captured him and Blackbeard got away. So when they first captured him, they put 2 guards to watch him on house arrest, but literally they say that he escaped dressed as a woman and escaped to Sullivan's Island for a while, but then he was recaptured. So they take him in and basically embarrassed and humiliated him publicly, hanged him and let him sit there in the town without his wigs for like months. Or I guess this was just to spread a message to pirates everywhere not to mess with the South Carolinians, but I don't know. It just seems like some weird story if you ask me. They also want to say that the reason Charleston was a fortified city was because there were 150 Spaniards, American Indians, and quote, mulattoes. Or natives, right? That's what they say, natives with 1 white and 1 black parent. Who's the black parent? Now, if we look into the origins of this word, we can see that it's not used to describe natives, no, but those people who are mixed of African and European ancestry. This is considered to be outdated and offensive in mainstream circles now, but it is a reference to the hybridization process with these bloodlines. Literally, it says, quote, some sources suggest that it may derive from the Portuguese word mula, from Latin mulus, meaning mule, the hybrid offspring of a horse and a donkey. The Real Academia Española traces its origin to mulo in the sense of hybridity, originally used to refer to any mixed race person, end quote. In English, printed usage of mulatto dates to at least the 16th century. The 1595 work Drake's Voyage first used the term in the context of intimate unions producing biracial children. The Oxford English Dictionary defined mulatto as, quote, one who is the offspring of a European and a black. The earliest usage regarded black and white as different species, with mulatto constituting a third separate species, end quote. Quote, according to Julio Izquierdo Labrado, the 19th century linguist Leopoldo Aguillas y Yanguas, as well as some Arabic sources, muwalad is the etymological origin of mulatto. These sources specified that mulatto would have been derived directly from muwalad, independently of the related word mulati, a term that was applied to Iberian Christians who had converted to Islam during the Moorish governance of Iberia in the Middle Ages, end quote. So, we have to be willing to invert the picture simply just to observe it, not to accept it as fact. But if these people really are inverting everything, we need to be willing to flip it and look at it from a different angle, especially when it comes to the mainstream narrative. So now we get to the American Revolution. Yeah, but they literally funded it all. The Dutch East India Company was already well established. You think a few hundred migrants to a colony started by the largest corporations in the world, that somehow these migrants are just going to revolt and conquer such a mighty beast? No, this is an excuse to remove breadcrumbs. You see, this happens in every country. Oh, they gained sovereignty. Right, but they're still owned by the church? Revolutionary War? Who are they fighting? Their northern counterparts? Their bloodline connected Dutch families? Or, that's right, they're fighting back home the British? What evidence do we have that this truly happened? These journals and small artifacts that they show in the museums that could easily be fabricated? Anyway, they tell us that the greatest defeat in American history was the Siege of Charleston by the British in 1780. They literally tell us that it was one of the colonies of the British, but okay. The British was finally defeated in the Battle of King's Mountain, which this is important to note for later. And if we look at all the colonial coat of arms when America was founded, are we really to assume that any of this really ended or is how they present it to be? This gets us into the narrative of slavery because, with the Negro Act of 1740, the British supposedly made it so that slaves were legally made to be illiterate. So this isn't me saying this, that's what mainstream history says. So the slaves were illiterate, that's what they tell us, and that they are responsible for building all of Charleston. But did you know that most of Charleston since its founding consisted mostly of black inhabitants? That's what they tell us, that 2/3 of the population were black slaves, while the other portion were the land proprietors and wealthy white migrants. Even the Swiss immigrant Samuel Disley, 1731, said, quote, "Carolina looks more like a Negro country than like a country settled by white people," end quote. And this quote was actually in the historic South Carolina Museum. So we're going to be questioning the narrative with keen minds, as there's no reason why we shouldn't. They're telling us that all of Charleston was built by slaves, in other words, black hands, yet they were illiterate, had no money, were also branded by whites and owned as property. Yet we're to believe that they had the passion and willingness to build all these structures for white families to shit in while the slaves took the chamber pots and would just dump them in the street or river. Yeah, that makes sense. You could say that they grew up mind controlled, but even then, humans have their limits. I find it hard to believe that all of Charleston was built by slaves who were treated as cattle. You also had privies or necessary homes, which were small buildings constructed of the main house, similar to a latrine, but they were designed so that they could be cleaned by the slaves on a daily basis. They also had slave tags, which were literally numbered, and I would consider this branding of products. Yet they said these slaves were jolly and played all sorts of music and that they would intermarry with their slave owners, so they definitely didn't just own them. But wait, what about Southern hospitality? Because we'll come back to that, but I'm from the South and I'm telling you, sure, there's neo-Nazis and crazy people who exist, but the vast majority of people do not see race like that and do not care about it like that. Of course, I'm kind of talking pre-2020, and things are changing because Asheville, Columbia, and Charleston are all super liberal cities, which growing up I never really knew that. I always saw South Carolina as a red state, and it definitely is, but I'm just saying, in the cities, they are extremely liberal, and you can tell if you just go into the stores and talk with the locals and historians. We will see this as we continue. And by the way, I have no problems with liberals or Republicans or anything polarized like that. I'm just trying to separate and view the entire subject from a third perspective, so please, let's avoid strawmans. Let's just say that Charleston is super petty. That's what the tour guide said. And also, they were on board with everything that's going on today. Can't really say much more than that. All I'm trying to say is I got questions, but we continue. So yeah, After the country of South Carolina became a part of the United States, it was still owned by the British. Well, if we look at the coat of arms of the Continental Army and the coat of arms of South Carolina during this time, I think we can see that the snake is behind both of these movements. Now, supposedly, the British promised the African slaves freedom during this time so that they could all come running to help fight with the British or something, and they would be guaranteed freedom in exchange. So, the Continental Army was literally composed of British families such as Horatio Gates, weirdly, and General Henry Clinton was a British Army officer, which little is known about this guy, but he was also named the governor of Gibraltar with the coat of arms of a castle and key. He is claimed to have made a mistake, but somehow he had gained the trust of the Cherokee as well to fight with them, so it seems that everyone was involved in this. But this has to do now with the loyalist and those who want to separate and create the new world, right? Remember, we had to think about this differently now. Problem, reaction, solution. And so we can't be polarized when exploring history. The Charleston equivalent to the Tea Party happened in 1767 when a shipment of tea was dumped into the Cooper River. Some shipments were allowed to land, but they would just let it rot in the stores. They say over 200 battles were fought, yet I'm not sure why they're so convinced with such flimsy evidence. I mean, Benjamin Lincoln surrendering to Clinton, and yes, I do think names are important since they're literally just copy and pasting them everywhere. You don't think we should dissect them? So many people think of the South and they think of cotton, right? But South Carolina, and specifically Charleston, was made on rice and indigo dye. This indigo dye is also related to other dyes such as the purple dyes that were extracted from snails, which is also connected to how they produced purple, which is a Royal Phoenician export. Quote, Low Country wealth was intertwined with rice for generations. From the 1720s to the early 1860s, no other commodity was remotely as important to the region. Indigo, cotton, forest products, and manufacturing never came close to matching the riches that planters drew from their rice estates. End quote. Quote, with rough tools, slaves cleared immense wooded swamps. Then they constructed massive hydrological systems, dams, dikes, and floodgates called trunks, used to irrigate rice fields where they sowed and weeded the grain. End quote. I'm not trying to underestimate the power of humans, but again, we're dealing with passion, intellect, vast experience in agriculture, yet they say they were illiterate and basically treated as subhuman. You also have to think about what is this overarching narrative. They're basically saying that blacks were primitive for all their history until after the Civil War. Or at least, that is what we're presented with when it comes to the slave narrative, where we're conveniently never told about the Royal Black Moorish Empire and their influence on Europe along with the Rosicrucian Order. Why are these things not really talked about, and why is it when you walk into one of these South Carolina museums, there's no mention of Black Royal Moorish ancestry? Sure, you can research them independently, but the point is, why is it when looking up the topic of slavery, specifically in America with the Civil War, it's as if they don't want to connect these two topics together for some reason? It's this whole idea that blacks were just natives of Africa who were then brought to America, right? But like we mentioned, they were sold off by the royal kings of Africa. Remember, Secret Black History on Africa video, there were castles that are no longer there in Africa, which at the time were perhaps Moorish in origin, like the Berbers of North Africa, who are also mixed with these royal bloodlines. No race is attached to slavery over any other race. Yet when you go to these museums, this is all they want to tell you. Like, they are definitely trying to program you with a specific perspective of reality. So one of these buildings is called the fireproof building that was built by Robert Mills, who we're going to cover soon, but this building is now the South Carolina Historical Museum. So anyways, I go in there and the whole place is like empty. No one goes to Charleston really to study history, except the people who are going to the college, and we'll talk about that shortly in the following chapters, but there was an exhibit in this museum that I want to talk about a little bit early because it ties in with all of this. So they're like super weird about it too, like they confront that Charleston has a shady history, but then they're like, oh, there's good and bad. And I'm sitting here looking at this exhibit and I'm like, wait, what? They had slave tags. These white men supposedly owned over 20 slaves, if not hundreds in some cases. And all they have are these letters and journals and some newspaper articles talking about selling slaves and a Negro runaway named Mercury, which weirdly these publications were also called Mercury, so not sure what's up with that, but yeah, they just say that they were happy making music and dancing while all of this was going on. But then during this time around the founding of America, slaves would literally be sent to asylums in what was called the sugar house, where they would literally be tortured into obedience. This was also done to what we know as Native Americans, but they just don't really talk about that as much. I'll leave an article on the sugar house, but it's pretty horrifying. The idea is that these were all mind control victims. And to be honest, this was happening to some degree. You have to understand there's always mix between truth and lies. There were definitely people being turned into slaves, but it wasn't literally just the black population who they say they imported by the millions through the Dutch and English East India companies. Or I should probably say West, but regardless, these huge shipping companies were sending these slaves over to America, right? So, of course, there's going to be a narrative that would in turn explain where these slaves came from for future generations and the millennia to come. Now, of course, that is coming from the assumption that perhaps there is something else going on with this entire narrative. Now, I want to bring up Dane Calloway and Karimio, who I believe to be the biggest channels discussing these topics. There are others for sure, but they have done a great job of compiling alternative Moorish history. The only difference I really have with them is they seem to label the enemy or parasites as a single race or phenotype, meaning the white man, when I label the enemy as more of a spiritual parasite and corruption that took over humanity as a whole. That doesn't take away though that there is some good information provided. So Karimio has a video on this too, so shout out to him. I actually found out about this video after the trip, but I've been watching him for a long time, so I definitely see this as a synchronicity, but he has this video on the Sephardic Jews, or these French Huguenots, who were really freed black slave masters or the real plantation owners of the South. Don't take my word for it, just look into it yourself. This was purposely omitted from history and the museums because they're set forth on presenting a narrative to the populace. So it seems. This narrative is that black peoples were never anything but slaves. And think about it, this works into the modern day politics, which I'm not even going to cover, but I'm sure most of you can make your own connections on how victimhood and identity crisis is still being used today to exploit and manipulate people into a cycle of hatred. They tell us that the blacks of today in America are the descendants of the Gula Geechee people, a blend of African and European. But the weird thing is that they have these famous figures that they present in the museum, and I never mentioned either that just like in the Biltmore video, you know how I was saying that I had this feeling that was kind of like a bad vibe where profit was involved and it just made me feel sick? Well, I swear I had the exact same sensation when I was in this museum, and it was weird because I was like here all alone. There was no one here in the museum, and I was just looking at these pictures and I was like, what are they even trying to say? It's kind of disgusting, honestly. These historians, right? And there are a bunch of young liberals that really have no idea, are not even trying to make connections like this, right? They're just regurgitating and have to go through a process of rote memorization, right? They have to take tests. And I guess this seems to be a common theme that we're going to see throughout this video. Like, they're literally saying that these Gullah people couldn't even speak English with this old proverb and it's all distorted. And again, I'm sure that part of this is true, but it's not a true representation of all black people around the entire world, right? And who they are descended from. We have the right to question this narrative, as we already brought up several good points on Moorish history. Why are these historians not bringing this up? These people literally went to college for almost 8 years, I'm not kidding you, and it's just mind-numbing once you go there with open eyes. And I'm not trying to come off wrong, but what we're dealing with is a presentation and manipulation, yet the people who work there and the locals, they just repeat the narrative. Talking about the historians, they're all like, yeah, that's weird. You know, and they'll talk about all these things like the Prohibition and how the porches are facing the side of the houses. It's almost as if everybody knows that something isn't really right about Charleston, yet it seems that 99% of the people are not really that curious about what is displayed before them, or at least it felt that way. For example, they were promoting this Priscilla Ball, who was kidnapped as a child, brought to Charleston as a slave from Sierra Leone, which, by the way, this is where they say most of the slaves came from, which is another Royal Lion outpost, which started when black loyalists of, again, more bloodlines here settled it and started the Sierra Leone Company. These black pioneers invaded Nova Scotia and began to expand there. Now, I find it interesting that when you're researching this for the black loyalists, there are no pictures of these figures. For example, Thomas Peters, there isn't really anything shown, but he was the founding father of Sierra Leone. For some reason this isn't on Wiki, but here it is at the museum. This guy was loyal to Britain, they say. He was a royal puppet, or he is a royal bloodline who had deep connections with other families. Now that we're aware of this pursuit to hide these black loyalists, we can question other founders that have been painted white in history books, but could have very well been black as well. I mean, we see Moors on several crests throughout Europe. There's no denying that they were involved with these royal bloodlines. You can even see them holding the rose, showing they are all part of this entire Rosicrucian Reformation, the divide and conquer tactic. This was all planned for by the royal elites. Oh, and there's even a crest with a Moorish queen and a bear. Reminds me of Calafia. There are many of these on early European heraldry. It wasn't until the transatlantic slave trade that these images were sought out and suppressed. So for now, that'll be our short intro into the alternative view on Black history. But we will continue as we move into the Civil War. Some other weird Charleston stories include some intense female figures like Anne Bonny and Lavina Fisher. Anne Bonny was this pirate from Ireland who I guess was like a rebel and got tired of her father's plantation, so she became a pirate, and legend has it that she burned the entire plantation to the ground. So I don't really know if I buy all that, because women back then were subservient to men. Now, sure, maybe this is a similar thing where they're portraying women as the perpetual victim, but secretly behind the scenes there were elite women's circles operating. Either way, it's a similar phenomena. But yeah, we have the story of Judge Trot, which this was told in detail on the tour, but the guide said that Judge Trot was the first judge of Charleston, and he was this mean old guy who also was behind the Steed Bonnet trials. But essentially, what would happen in early Charleston is that men would be walking with their wives, and if they even looked at another man, the husband could go to the judge and literally say, "Hey, I think my wife was cheating just because she looked at another guy." And then Judge Trot would find this to be plenty of evidence, right? So he would convict her and then sentence her to public humiliation, and also they would be branded. So the tour guide said that most women of Charleston who were branded ended up dead. But yeah, they would come and take your wife, put her in a cage, or even in one of those pillory things. People just accept this, like, this was the best we could think of, is to just throw people on the streets and treat it like a show. So people would point their finger and say, ha ha, look at the guy, or I mean, in this case, women, and they would treat them as if they weren't even human, right? That's the whole point, to make it humiliating, to throw rotten tomatoes. But dude, it was even worse than that. They were throwing mud, offal, which is basically organ meats, dead animals, and excrement. This is the sign of a culture with low awareness, which is apparent in the drunks and all these councilmen participating in mass amounts of prostitution. Not only that, in the early days, we're talking about same-sex rituals. This was obviously lost in future lodges, but in the early days, this is the stuff they would do. Because remember, they weren't judged on their works, but their faith alone. Right. If they were to do one of these public humiliation rituals in the modern day, people would be shocked in horror. We humans are sympathetic by nature. It's only by corruption of the few that we have arrived to where we are. But the only way this could have been acceptable is if we were truly in a dark age. And if that is the case, we deserve to question what's going on with the mainstream narrative. Who were these people? And were they truly the ones who built Charleston? Or, as the experts say, a medieval fortified city? So, another weird story is that they say that the slave market, which never really sold slaves, but that the slaves would go there, sell food, and make money, yet they say that the slaves were illiterate. So wait, who were they selling for? Their masters? That doesn't really make sense. But forgetting about all that, this place has these death skulls on top, which they say is because it used to be a butcher shop, but I like to be questionable about everything. They say that in order to keep the city clean, which remember, all these cities are suffering from diseases like syphilis, yellow fever, cholera, and they never really try to consider where this may be coming from, yet these streets are completely filled with fecal matter, and everyone is sticking their pokers in any hole they can find, but okay, we'll come back to that. So, they talk about how there were so many dead bodies, not just animals, like literally bodies of humans too, and these dead carcasses of rotten meat and leftover food was all over the streets. And they basically had these vultures that would come and eat all the food, and they tell this little quirky story like, oh, these vultures cleaned up the streets and they got so fat that they couldn't fly anymore. Isn't that neat? I'm just sitting there like, what is going on here? But yeah, that's another weird story they tell. Charleston also has a bunch of dungeons that the tour also covers, in which you explore essentially underground chambers where they kept prisoners. Now what they don't cover is the engineering aspects of all of this, but we will come back to that soon towards the finale. Then we have a bunch of great cataclysms, so we got a lot of exciting things to talk about, such as great earthquakes, great fires, and more, but not even the local historians nor tour guides seem to be aware of some of these more rare events. One last thing I wanted to note before we move on is just the sheer lack of evidence for all these claims, including the Civil War battles. It's almost laughable that the museum put this up, a sketch of a Civil War drawing, and it was just so funny, but seriously, there really is no photographic evidence of the Civil War. We only have photos of portraits of men, groups, some pictures of the aftermath, but not the war itself. Don't you think it would be insane to see a photo of 12,000 men lined up on a battlefield? Right, we have these really intense paintings, we have journals, we have historical details. It's not far out to say that all of that can be fabricated. Anything else? Doesn't really seem like this is enough to me, but yeah, prepare yourself because we're about to cover Fort Sumter in its entirety and analyze this whole Civil War story that we learned from the day we enter the education systems. Okay, so we move on to Fort Sumter, but we're still in the history portion of this presentation. A little bit later, we'll be speaking about our trip there and discussing some alternative theories as to the true purpose behind these structures. There's no way we can completely analyze every single story about the Civil War in one video, but we can cover it generally and in just the context of Fort Sumter. You see, the American Civil War is considered to be the most deadliest conflict the United States has ever had. They tell us more than 600,000 people lost their lives. This is more than all of the other wars the US has fought combined from Revolutionary to Vietnam. Something that we have to consider is that when you grow up and you see the same presentations and movies in the mainstream, and yes, this includes the stories that are parroted by local historians, we become convinced as a nation of a reality that may have never truly happened the way it's been presented. All we know is the information that the compulsory school system gives us. There's an estimated 50,000 or more books on the subject of the Civil War, from novels to descriptions of all the battles, but we're gonna try and simplify everything and just ask some very basic questions. So during this time in the early 19th century, the United States had the most slaves than any other nation. As Lincoln put it in 1854, quote, "The monstrous injustice of slavery deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites," end quote. I'm not sure what he's talking about because the truth of the matter is that the Dutch and English have both used slaves for several hundreds of years. This whole concept of abolitionists, they came in and they continued this narrative, and it seems that the Union was much smaller than the Southern Republic, and they both seem to have this weird snake symbolism. This will be explored more too, but the mainstream narrative is that this is a symbol of secession and them being traitors. Well, then why did the South boast this symbol as well? The entire United States was founded on slavery, they tell us, from the cities to the plantations to almost the entire infrastructure. It wasn't just blacks, we're talking Native Americans, Asians, Irish. This involved every race. Yet out of nowhere, all of a sudden people started getting feelings and now they're wanting abolition, or was this another political movement altogether? The Constitution wouldn't have been ratified if it didn't approve of slavery, they said, so it was totally legal. They make it clear that the North thought slavery was wrong, but the explanation on how they got to the mindset is a little shady in its origin. First off, there was no Democrat versus Republican. In the eyes of the church, everyone in America were really liberals as we know now, Protestants who deny the notion that you must do good works to get into heaven. So there's no reason morally, as slavery was the foundation for early Christianity. They use this as a reason for why America was founded on pure values, yet early Puritans were very rash in their punishments. They would burn humans at the stake simply for being accused of a crime. Is this any worse than the Catholics? Let's consider who we're dealing with, the European nations, which the mainstream story is that Spain, England, and the Dutch, which as we explained are Germanic speaking languages, they all have family crests showing who they are in allegiance to. Why are we supposed to believe that there was any fighting between these families? Sure, migrants moved in and they say natives were there to fight back as well, but then they will contradict themselves, as we will soon see, because these natives just give them land. So then they decide to fight with them for supposed freedom. And it wasn't just a Revolutionary War with the Black Loyalists. The Native Americans and black slaves were all forced to be in the Civil War. We'll explain that shortly. These are the stats. They say that the Union had 22 million people, but they don't tell us how many slaves. I'm going to assume 0 because they didn't mention it. Then, at the Confederacy, they had 9 million people and 3.5 million slaves. Wait, didn't you say at the beginning that there were 3 times the amount of blacks as whites? What happened with the population count? The contradictions are endless. Like how photography was really started in the early 1840s, and by the 1850s, they were masters of photographic compositing, which involved the combination of multiple negatives. It was possible to combine over 20 different photographs during this time period. Yet, get this, we have no photos of the Civil War. We have portraits, we have the officials, political leaders, the supposed Confederates, and all these frat club boys hanging out together, nice clean uniforms. We see pictures of destruction and some sort of aftermath, but we don't see photographs of the actual war. Why not? By 1861, when the Civil War really started, photography had been in the public sphere for over a decade. In fact, daguerreotypes was a camera invented by the French, they tell us, in 1839. This, in mainstream history, and I'm kind of honestly tired of hearing the same point, well, oh, they had exposure issues. Not really, and they weren't strapping people to chairs to take these portraits. That's just another quirky little story they tell us. Now, every one of these photos were also touched up, as this was a career back then. You were a professional photoshopper, and you would add contrast and sharpness to the image. There's no way you could do that with a long exposure image. It would be way too blurry, and they did have what were called camera guns, or little revolver type cameras that would actually shoot footage at 12 frames per second. So yeah, they at least had the ability to do stop motion. So why didn't they use this technology during this time? Too busy fighting over slavery, huh? Essentially what we're told is that right around the 1800 period, or really 1812, which we'll come back to in the cataclysm part, but this is when the North started caring and there was this division between slave and free state, problem, reaction, solution. This polarity will be consistent throughout our analysis of history. This gets into the fugitive slave states and the Underground Railroad video, which we've made a video going into detail on that subject, but they say this is a symbol for the movement of these runaways into these different routes and hideouts on their journey to free states. So again, we have novels and propaganda, these stories being told here, and anytime you hear something that's being parroted but there really isn't that much evidence for it, you just gotta start asking questions. Not only are there no slave ships still in existence, but the only ones that are were remodeled and redesigned, and its legitimacy is questionable. But furthermore, the physical and literal nature of the Underground Railroad deserves some critical thought, because it is said that there were literal underground railroads in which these early colonists would use for travel. The remnants of these have now been converted into sewer systems in modern cities, which, interestingly, it's illegal to go in without written permission from the city. Also, blacks owned blacks during this time, another convenient history they seem to avoid. The Sephardic Jews and the Arabic Moorish Empire were not only working for the Spanish, but the Moors were in Spain for the past 300 years, until all of a sudden in the 1500s, Rome decided to split up the entire world, so where Spain would conquer the New World and Portugal would go to Africa. I find this interesting because in 1621, a black man by the name of Anthony Johnson was the first true real slave owner. We also need to distinguish between an indentured servant and a slave, which they were merged to mean the same thing in the modern day, but they're not the same thing. These were loyal workers that would essentially be your servant, kind of like valet or a butler for wealthy individuals. They didn't hate their job, and they actually did it with passion because they were treated with respect and paid very well. I'm just saying that would make more sense on why we see very few revolts in this time period, but we really have to change our perspective on slavery from being forced to actually being mutually agreed upon. Now that may be shocking, but I'm not saying that. I'm just reading the history books and asking questions. Anthony Johnson himself was an indentured servant for these black royal Arabs, and they say he was a slave, but look, then they say he completed his contract. So wait, was he a slave or was it a contract? Remember, because they're telling us that slaves were treated as subhuman, like they were animals, or remember the whole New York Zoo stuff? So victims use this point a lot, but this is a setup. They did this on purpose to suppress Moorish history. I mean, who set up this show? You trust them? So, if they were nothing but slaves with tags and essentially were branded and, they were brought in these slave ships and just humiliated, then how did this guy fulfill his contract, get free, and become a wealthy land and slave owner in the 1640s? That's over 200 years before the Civil War. He owned over 250 acres of land and owned multiple black slaves, one who was named John Casser because in a court order of 1655, they decided that Johnson could hold Casson as much as he likes. So now, there were actually legal sanctions in place so that blacks could hold slaves of their own race. He was literally the first slave owner in America. This was 15 years before it was written into law so that not only whites could own slaves, but blacks and Indians could own slaves as well. So wait, hold up, why are we not taught about that when we go to these slavery museums? All I see is a misrepresentation. Lies by omission. Another clue that both the Union and Confederacy were both just different boy clubs is we never discuss what's going on with the Masons during all this time. They had multiple lodges all over America. What was their position? Oh, let me guess, they took the exact same position as the Rosicrucians during the Reformation era? So, I'm gonna go ahead and bring this up early, but one of the main symbols for South Carolina is the palmetto tree on the flag. But notice how there's a crescent. Now I swear, when I first saw this, and I'm not really from South Carolina, but when I first came in and saw the flag, I immediately thought it looked Arabic in origin. And I've also seen it with the star as well, but we're going to truly question the meaning behind this flag, and towards the end, I'll give you the final key, but let's just say that this has to do with William Moultrie, which is a French in origin name. I'm suspicious of his origins, but the first flag did not have a palmetto. It was simply a blue flag with a crescent that said Liberty. Then, the palmetto was added after 1861. There's no explanation on the reason for the crescent. Obviously, palmettos are not only in South Carolina, but only South Carolina is the palmetto state. Well, let's see what you think towards the end of the video. So, we have to talk about this whole secession and the snake symbolism because it's really weird that you also see this in the early flags of the South. They have the palmetto with a snake going around it, and the answer seems to be that the Union wanted to literally strangle the South by blocking the southern seaports and preventing the export of tobacco and cotton, and they would block the import of arms. Then we hear of the popular newspaper cartoon Scott's Great Snake, or the Anaconda Plan. It shows this great snake that throttles its victims, but why is the South taking on this symbol for themselves and also making it quite biblical in nature? Just a sneak peek for later, but this literally says built from the ruins. So the definition of slave is the ownership of another human being by another. They say slaves usually worked without pay, but hold up, you're saying there are situations where the slaves were paid. Also, they claim that slavery was actually better than the conditions that blacks had on their own in the factories up north because slavery down south made them more civilized. We see the runaway rewards and Uncle Tom's Cabin, even all the punishment devices, yet wait, why aren't we learning about the Sephardic Jews and how Moors owned all of Europe for over 300 years? That's conveniently left out of Black History Month. You know what's funny about all this? Is that Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and Abraham Lincoln, who was the president of the Union, they look literally exactly the same. It's just that Jefferson decided to shave before getting his picture taken. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. I was at the museum and thought this, and after doing research, I found out many other people thought the exact same thought. Coming to find out they're brothers? But wait, they're not brothers? Or there's like a debate about whether they're related or not. No one seems to really know the answer, but It's very interesting that many people seem to see the similarity. To me, I think these brothers are mocking us. I'll explain more shortly, but these crests and symbols that they give us are the only clues that we have that they're communicating with each other. Also, another thing they say is that people back then were super short, but these brothers were over 6 feet tall. I'll mention this later when we get to the tour part, but they say that they were both unusually tall for their time period. What are the chances that two unrelated, abnormally tall men who look nearly identical are the spearheads of this massive war scenario? What I'm getting to with all this is symbolism. They were brothers. This is not the only reference to a brothers' war, as there was a Civil War battle known as the Brothers' War, which was between Union General Philip St. George Cooke and the Confederate Cavalry General James L.L. Brown Stewart. The historians are saying that this is an example on how, at the Tennessee and Kentucky border, the war was separating families and they would literally kill each other over this polarized issue. But we have to see the hidden symbolism here. It's called the Brothers' War, which could be interpreted as Freemasonic brothers, not literal brothers, but brothers in purpose and end goal. We can only find this out by looking at their symbolism, not by regurgitating the thoughts they want us to think when it comes to the presented history given in all these mainstream books and institutions. Basically, because Kentucky stayed neutral, they say that many families became divided on this political issue. They have this whole back and forth where Confederates would say that Lincoln and the Union were evil, and vice versa. It's the exact same stuff that's going on today. So you really can't talk about Charleston's history or South Carolina history without really bringing up the Civil War and, of course, Fort Sumter, which I got some questions to ask later because they said that they had multiple forts in one, and they even called one a castle. Fort Sumter is where the first shots of the Civil War happened, as this was so famously mentioned in the Charleston Mercury. Quote, "Border Southern states will never join us until we have indicated our power to free ourselves. The fate of the Southern Confederacy hangs by the ensign halyards of Fort Sumter." End quote. And if you just think about it, why does the Union want to do this when the truth is, according to what they tell us, all of America was founded on slavery? Literally the whole economy functioned on this aspect, and even the factories up north were abusing this issue. The Industrial Revolution, all these kids working in factories. I mean, come on. None of these people really had an option to begin with. It was either join the Union or die, right? Or they're going to try to make it seem as if the Union were the good guys in this story, but we must always question the heroes when being presented with the official history. So, as soon as South Carolina seceded from the Union, Governor Pickens ordered that all federal property be given up so that the Southern Republic would now have ownership. Abraham Lincoln wrote in that supplies were being sent to Fort Pickens, and as it didn't have any arms on it, that they should just let it come in. But they didn't want Fort Pickens to be supplied, so Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, decided to see this as a challenge. Seems like some weird brotherhood drama. But anyways, he decided that it was crucial that they take over Fort Pickens before it was supplied by this shipment. Then, the Confederate General Pierre Beauregard ordered his cannons to open fire on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861 at 4:30 in the morning. Supposedly, they literally did this non-stop for 2 days straight. So imagine what it once looked like, but eventually, Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander of Fort Sumter, was short on supplies, of course, because they rushed in, and so they had to give up the fort. News didn't reach north until 2 days later, they say, and when Lincoln found out, he was pissed, and so he began to gather, quote, volunteers for taking back the fort of the Union. This is going to become very questionable because the truth is, slaves were fighting for both sides. You had blacks fighting for the Union under the propaganda of being freed, yet many were killed in the process. And then you have the same thing with Native Americans. All of these people were being forced into a war regardless of what side you picked. If you didn't, then you would be seen as a traitor, as it was just said that it was impossible to be neutral during this time, as the case with Kentucky. We'll come back to that, but interestingly, Major Anderson, the Union soldier at the fort during this time, was from Kentucky and a slave owner himself too, so... Over 4,000 cannon shells are to have been exchanged at Fort Sumter. During this time, each state had their own militia, as it was enacted in law with the Militia Act of 1795. So after Lincoln called for help,